mean, it was just 2008, 2010, where there were entire streets that had foreclosure signs.
You had millions of people asking for help on their loans to companies that had no interest in helping them.
We were being lied to. City mortgage employees continually lied to us over the phone. When I asked them specific questions, they would never answer the questions.
My husband had a spinal cord injury, rendering him paralyzed. So Wells Fargo offered us a loan modification. They didn't return phone calls. They provided me misinformation. People were being paid to lie to us, paid to disappear, and they never had any intention of helping us.
Several employees from Bank of America were given Target and Best Buy gift cards for foreclosing on homeowners.
These were just document mills that would just sign any piece of paper that was necessary in order to convince a judge to let him take the house.
All of the documents that were signed by these robo-signers, they sit behind me. It's 39,000 of them, and they're all fraudulent. These banks, they were a front. They were a front for a criminal enterprise.
Our whole regulatory system was a failure when it came to this issue.
The jury was kept from seeing my aunt's exculpatory evidence. The evidence that was pro-Barbara got shut out.
I heard from a former Chief Justice, you know that the outcome is dependent upon where the judge believes he's been placed in the revenue stream. Who does him the biggest financial favors? So in other words, you're saying that they're bought off.
At the time that I was running, I challenged my opponent not to take money from any banks that got government bailout money. And I did get a call from Washington telling me to be careful because there were a lot of people who got that money who were in my party.
Where people can get away with stuff, they will. And the best place to get away with stuff is have a big corporation that's traded on the stock exchange that gives a lot of money to lobbyists and politicians and make it so complicated that nobody can ever figure out what the fuck you did. And you win.
If there is an alarm to be sounded in the aftermath of 2008, it is when you have too much wealth in too few hands, the rule of law begins to collapse.
All the Americans who are still out of work, got low wages, huge student debts, underwater homes. All these problems are a direct result of the financial crash.
The failure to rescue the American working and middle class in the Great Recession, that has set us on the trajectory to where we find ourselves today.
It's the fight between Main Street and Wall Street, between the big banks and real people.
I'm not supposed to win. Borrower's not supposed to win. That is this game, is if you've got the money, you can make the law or you can buy the law.
No individual faced any accountability for any of this.
I have a new definition for the perfect crime. Perfect crime is a crime that involves everybody.
Do you know what the American people would do if those leaders of those banks were indicted? It would send a message loud and clear that the game's over. And we let them off the hook. We let them off the hook.
The only way it's going to change is the same way it was affected, which was millions of people have finally fucking had it.
Ladies and gentlemen, what you just watched right there was the trailer for the series called The Con. And there's a lot to mine there, and that's what we're going to be doing today. Welcome back to the Ben Stewart Podcast. And just wow, if you've ever felt that the corruption of the monetary and finance sectors were real and legitimate, but thought that it could somehow be explained away through ignorance, ineptitude, and the unintended consequences of otherwise well-intentioned people, you're going to want to listen to this program slowly and methodically. So don't speed it up. Take your time with it. Today we have the filmmaker, the writer, and the producer of the Con series that you just watched the trailer of, Patrick Lovell, with over 2 decades in this craft. He's worked with and for the biggest names in Hollywood like Warner Brothers and Paramount, with rock and roll stars, sports, and politicians, but became an indie producer and investigative journalist after his world was turned upside down and inside out as a result of the 2008 great financial crisis. Since then, he's made the documentary film Forward 13, and Docuseries The Con, of which you just saw the trailer, and that answers who's in charge and why. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's get Patrick Lovell in here on the Ben Stewart Podcast. My man, Patrick, how you doing?
Good to see you, Ben, man. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, this is really interesting. This has been a long time coming. I'm glad that we got this worked out. And you're hailing from Salt Lake City, Utah. Is that correct?
Yeah, not originally, but I've been in Utah off and on for quite a while.
Okay, right on. Well, I mean, this is beautiful, and we started with your trailer to give everybody just a little bit of an insight into what we're going to be diving into primarily today. But really what I want to do is I want to ask, before we launch into what we're going to be talking about today, how did you go from, well, first, maybe even how did you get into Hollywood and why did you want that? And I could see the 2008 great financial crisis was the turning point for you, but kind of lead us through that, Hollywood, what you were doing there, and then just give us kind of a little picture of what that was like to be awoken by that financial crisis, and then how that launched you into the path that you're on now.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to give you that story, but I think the thing that I want to, sorry, my head's sticking out of the frame. Just mention at the outset, because I want everybody to remember this when they associate my name with anything. I want everybody to know that I'm the only one that will tell you that Federal Reserve Act 13.3 was used illegally. Now, that's a very obscure way to open up and to respond to your question, Ben. But it took me 13 years to get to that understanding, and I literally had to go to the ends of the world and back to understand what that means. And to your specific question, well, good-intentioned people might skirt around specific issues to keep things somewhat obscured, is really the entire rationale behind power. And it took me a lifetime to understand really the mechanisms, and the only way you do that is to be in the game. And so I always had this ambition to be a part of Hollywood because I love movies. In fact, the film that really inspired me to take the jump was none other than Oliver Stone's Wall Street. In fact, I remember I was a junior in high school when that film came out, and I was just dumbstruck by the sort of pressure of, the protagonist played by Charlie Sheen, which was Bud Fox. And of course, like most Americans, he was ambitious, very clever, very capable. He was going to play every angle the way he had to get to where he wanted to be. And that became ultimately the culture of the world that I grew up in the 80s, which was, there's a lot of different sorts of things that took place at that time. But one of which became this sort of mantra that Oliver Stone resonated, that came back to haunt us decades later, which is greed is good. So I just figured, when I graduated from college, I studied political science. I minored in journalism. I had a real commitment to my dream, the American dream. I wanted to become something that was I didn't realize it at the time, but a producer. And so I did what anybody who's ambitious in Hollywood did. I dove in and, scraped together the ability to work on small projects, in any capacity I could. Then I worked my way in through temp situations into big Hollywood offices. And the next thing I know, I'm doing the sort of strata that you do at that stage where you read scripts, you do coverage, you try to move things forward, and then you start to, kind of see the business of movie making from inside the machine. And that always put me in close proximity to people I was working for. So I was a small fish in a big pond. I worked for some of the biggest executive producers in Hollywood. And it was amazing because I got to be at this intersection of attorneys and business development executives and creative executives and producers, and then ultimately the executive producers and the agencies. And you got to see, okay, where the money's coming from, who's involved, for what reason, and you got to see how the entire, paradigm existed. So that was absolutely huge for me. But yeah. I dropped out in, let's say, I guess it was 1999. I dropped out because the pressure got really insane, and I just hit the eject button real quick, like a lot of people do, to try to regain my center, because I was basically swimming with sharks at that time. And I landed in Park City, Utah. And the one thing led to another. I just happened to find out there was a small television station there, but I became a producer, and it was right in the middle of the Sundance Film Festival. So the next thing I knew, I was doing all of these productions in and around Sundance, and I ended up making the official television program of the Sundance Film Festival. So I was end up doing, projects with guys like Metallica or Robert Redford and Meryl Streep, and, pretty much every Academy Award winner for like the previous 10 years of that, and then the following 10 years from that time period. And, so I was like in this world of, I don't know, it was a dream come true in a lot of ways, but I was around really incredible people. I started doing action sports and all sorts of things. But ironically, because of that whole thing, a producer called me out of the blue one day and said, "Hey, man, I got a show that I want you to be a senior producer on, giving away houses all over the country." So it was like this reality television show of building houses up from the ground up to give to people that we, I think our tagline was something deserving people, giving them a leg up on the American dream. And one thing led to another. And I was doing shows in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago and New Orleans, all over the country. And we ended up really getting a lot of people to watch the show. And the time circuit was about 2007. The executive producer on the television show was flying around in a G5. They were out of Seattle. They were this large vertical residential and commercial developer. They were a big company, and they, funded the show. And then suddenly in 2007, man, they went bankrupt, like literally overnight. And it was like this huge head scratcher. Like, how does that happen? Well, the next thing I know, I'm like millions of other people at that time period. I was, doing pretty well. I was basically living, kind of a life. It took me, decades to realize. And I had a young family at the time. We're into our first house. And the next thing I know, man, my world got turned upside down. And I was dealing with like hyenas from hell in this situation where I felt like I was literally, like, if you can imagine in your worst fictional animated, drug-induced sort of nightmare, like you get thrown into like this hellish dystopia surrounded by demons, just basically doing everything they could to take you to hell. And then you tried to fricking get through that. That was my life. And that's what led me on this monumental journey.
Amazing, amazing. And just in case there are, let's see, how long ago was the 2008? That was 14 years ago. Let's just say that there are people watching that are under 14 years old or that lived under a rock throughout that entire period and don't really understand, let's just say, the official story of what the great financial crisis was. Could you just give us the bullet points that the media would be happy to tell the audience before we start diving in and unraveling it?
Well, the media told us and told everybody that, millions of Americans who, are just relatively unsophisticated people got extremely insatiable and greedy and lied about what they could afford to pay back on their loans, and collectively took down the entire global economy. That's what the actual sort of the mainstream narrative was. There was a moment when a guy by the name of Rick Santelli, who was on CNBC, and he's still on CNBC, and he's kind of like this libertarian, laissez-faire kind of, spokesperson for CNBC, and most of those guys are like that. They're basically what we would call inside the trade pumpers and dumpers. And ultimately, there was this moment, this Tea Party moment. In fact, this is what dominated the Tea Party. He was on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and he just basically went on this riff where he was going after Obama, and he was saying, "Look, we're going to reward people that took out extra loans to fix their houses, or did a partition for their garage, or their they wanted a new bathroom and everything else, and that we're going to give those people a bailout." Come on, Obama, are you kidding me? Next thing you know, because there was a lot of other things happening at the time, as everybody knows. So if you just look at MAGA, you could see, kind of the DNA of what was taking place at that time, which was the Tea Party. And it, didn't help matters if you look at the kind of the macro climate, that those people didn't want a black president anyway. So suddenly they were dumping on him that he was going to save the people that destroyed the economy and blame the victim. Meanwhile, Obama saved the people that destroyed the world. And yesterday, for example, and I know you're about to tee this up, but I think it's important for those, especially under 14 or even 23 and younger, is that, for example, Ben Bernanke, and probably a lot of people don't recognize that name, he was awarded the Nobel laureate yesterday.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So the Fed chair during the 2008 financial crisis for coming up with quantitative easing. Tell me about the brilliance that led to his Nobel laureate.
He's awarded the Nobel laureate, and many people might remember when Obama was awarded the Nobel laureate. A lot of folks that would be more in my kind of ideological persuasion were like, wait a second, the guy's like drone dropping bombs from drones, and he got the Nobel laureate. So there was some controversy affixed to that. But in this particular case, Ben Bernanke is singularly, well, you can't call him singularly because there was a trifecta at that time, which I'll get into, but he was probably most responsible, especially because of things he understood about Federal Reserve plumbing and that sort of thing. And he had theories because he was, presumed expert in the Great Depression. He's the guy that created Federal Reserve 13.3 that was used illegally.
Wait, he created 13.3?
No.
He's the one who used it illegally.
He's the one who used it illegally. He didn't create it. See, Federal Reserve, so everything that exists in government, as you well know, usually has some sort of constitutional mandate. Like there's going to be some sort of statutes that develop what exactly the purpose of that specific, anything like the Department of Justice or the Department of, of Defense, or you name it, across the board. There's legal statutes that are built within the Constitution that make that system run under the purview of the federal government of the United States. Now, there's always been, and probably more so now than ever before, even though there's a lot of sort of growing awareness of this, but there's always been this question is the Federal Reserve an independent apparatus? And what does that mean? Or does it function with accountability to government? And when you start to parse through that, you get to this question that you have to resolve, which is the difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy comes out of Congress. That's the stuff that gives us the ability to supposedly wage war, build, infrastructure, fund all sorts of different types of programs. And, that goes through the process that hopefully most of us understand by the time you graduate high school, which is bills become laws, they're debated, and then we fund. And that's what Congress's whole role is. Now, a lot of people might go, well, wait a second. We all know, and it depends on who you're talking to, we all know that the Federal Reserve is independent. Well, it's not independent. It was, of course, created to be accountable to Congress, like everything in government. But the question, Ben, you have to ask yourself, given what we just talked about, and you being around the block and people that you talk to that are very intelligent, would you say that Congress is in control of the Federal Reserve?
It does not seem so. And I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is after Ben Bernanke was Janet Yellen, correct?
That's correct.
And where is she now?
Treasury.
Yeah. That's kind of interesting, is like these same people circulating around in these spots. And she took what Ben Bernanke did with quantitative easing and just didn't stop, just basically gave ultimate assurance that I'll keep doing this, because what it seems like to me is, she was also doing the same thing of like, let's just kick the can down the road. There's this inevitable brick wall we're about to hit, but let's just kick the can down the road a little bit. And now here we are under Jerome Powell saying we're going to be the households and businesses are going to experience pain, and then he comes out saying we're going to experience more pain.
Well, let me touch upon that just briefly. So yes, Janet Yellen. Well, of course, and this is really kind of the way it was always intended from the beginning. I mean, you're familiar with technocrats, right? We have incredible educational institutions, specifically Ivy League or just off the cusp stuff like University of Chicago, and of course Stanford and others. But we generate a lot of mind power, right? A lot of groupthink, a lot of academia, and most of these folks, are experts in what we might call the plumbing of the details of how specific things are supposed to work. But therein lies this situation that you just identified, a revolving door, right? And so you want the people that have been there, supposedly, presumably, to be able to manage what is a very difficult and complex machine. So you have a 747, you want somebody who's trained to fly the 747, right? I mean, that's, if you have an aircraft carrier, you want somebody who actually knows how to be the captain of the ship, right? So these are just processes. These are major systems. But what ultimately has come to be, in which the whole reason that I am the only one who can tell you with no remorse, with no anything holding me back, that Federal Reserve Act 1333 was used illegally. So what does that mean in context to what you're talking about? So the Federal Reserve was mandated by Congress during the administration at the Federal Reserve of Alan Greenspan. Since you're about my age or slightly younger, you know Alan Greenspan was kind of like, he was the guy, right, for a very long time. And where did Alan Greenspan come from? Well, ironically, Alan Greenspan came out of Lincoln Continental. Lincoln Continental was involved with the largest bankruptcy in American history at that time that was presumed over a gentleman who was the CEO by the name of Keating. And Keating was involved with an incredible corrupt enterprise where it was known as the Keating Five, where he had 5 senators basically doing his bidding during the S&L crisis. That was I would say, phase one of what ultimately came the 2008 financial crisis, which is ultimately the system we live in. And so at that time period, Greenspan, because he's a laissez-faire guy who believed in the Ayn Randian myth of, the market can manage itself, they make him, coming out of that bankruptcy, which was absolute fraud, and fraud is not shenanigans like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama quipped on many occasions. Fraud is criminal theft by deception. I think this are aware of that are adults. Young people who don't know the ways of the world have seen it in a million movies, but they don't necessarily understand the term fraud is criminal theft by deception. And what does that mean? It means that if it's a crime and a white collar crime, it is a felony. This isn't a misdemeanor. This is a felony. And when you do felonies that are big felonies, you can be, if you are investigated and you're proved guilty, you go to jail, presumably. Now, the last time any white collar financial executive went to jail for these massive crimes was in the savings and loan crisis, which was the late 80s, early 90s. That happened as a result of a guy who became my mentor on the con. His name is William K. Black. They created 30,000 criminal referrals at that time for unbelievable grift, unbelievable commercial fraud that basically blew up that time period. And the reason why it's so important for you to understand this, everybody who's paying attention to this show, is that twofold. Well, first of all, 1,000 executives went to prison, okay? They all got nailed for what are crimes that are basically racketeering crimes. But Alan Greenspan came out of that and became the head of the Federal Reserve. Now, as it turns out, the Federal Reserve was mandated by Congress, which means must. If it says in the bylines that under this specific statute that I'm just about to tell you about, that the Federal Reserve must regulate the housing industry under what's called HOEPA statutes, Homeowner Equity Protection Act. But because Greenspan is this laissez-faire guy, let the market do what it will, and that's what he did for 20 plus years. We got that era's criminals from these banks thrown in prison, but a new batch of criminals started taking over at that time period, one of whom was Donald Trump. Donald Trump was up to his eyeballs in this savings and loan debacle that would use all sorts of funding from junk bonds. That was, if you might remember this guy's name, Michael Milken. Michael Milken actually eventually goes down for RICO, racketeering, corrupt organization, influenced corrupt organization statutes. They lessen the stuff downstream, and now Milken runs the world. But at that time, the guy was a criminal. And so ultimately, all of the stuff that happened with Donald Trump in New Jersey at that time with the Taj Mahal casino was wrapped up in the SNL stuff, as well as all the stuff that was taking place with junk bonds that Milken went down for. But Trump skirts the noose, 25 plus years later becomes president, goes through the whole thing that we end up with, January 6th and everything else. But just recently, the AG of New York, Letitia James, had a 200-page indictment of Donald Trump for control fraud that is based on all the stuff that happened in the SNLs. So when the mainstream media, for example, Ben, is like, well, why would the banks loan to this guy who's like hyper inflating the appraisals of his penthouse where it was worth like, let's call it was worth like 20 million, and he said it's worth like, 250 million, and that it was like 10,000 square feet, and it's worth, it's actually 10,000 square feet, but he said that it's worth 30,000, or it was 30,000 square feet. The mainstream media, like these geniuses like Rachel Maddow, who are getting paid $30 million a year to cherry pick situations, don't have that answer. They just ask this open-ended question. Meanwhile, he's doing that because that's how the system worked. It's called control fraud, and nobody in the world understands how it works. So that's why I went to the ends of the earth, hooked up with William K. Black. He taught me how the whole thing worked, and I went to the ends of the earth to put it on camera that blows up the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history that never ended.
Whoa, okay. So you're going to see the light change behind me. Power went out for some reason. I think you just blew a fuse there, Patrick.
Whoa. What's this?
Well, we'll roll with it. We'll roll with it. So the first thing that comes to mind is that it almost sounds like Operation Paperclip, that you need to have people from Nazi Germany take the fall, so it looks like there's some accountability. But the smartest people who came up with the racket get adopted into the new system. Basically, they get put into high positions of power in the new system. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
So this thing that you're talking about with, well, you know what? Before we even get all the way up to Trump, I want to understand a little bit better about the 2008 financial crisis and what you began discovering that went into the con.
Sure. Well, just briefly on Trump, though, and why it's relevant to the moment. Of course, we have, a growing sort of MAGA movement, right? And the midterms are upon us. And Biden, whether you think of him as Dark Biden or Rescue Democracy Biden, the bottom line is that the mainstream wants us to think that this is Rob Reiner on Twitter certainly wants us to think this as well, that Donald Trump is the end-all be-all, and that he is the ultimate threat to democracy. Donald Trump is at best a mid-level player, okay? And he is not the threat to democracy. The coup d'etat took place in 2009 as a result of what I'm about to tell you. So what was the con, and what was the great financial crisis, to answer your question? I think we all understand that home ownership in the United States, at least for my generation and before, was basically your ticket to the middle class. The idea is that you get into a house, you pay on time, that house builds equity over time. You ultimately own your home, and then that's your nest egg, at least for the working class it was. And later it became, as a result of what it is that unfolded to create the great financial crisis, where the fundamentals were completely out of whack. So prior to this time period, to be able to get a loan, typically you put down 20%, you had a job, the bank did underwriting, the bank actually held the loan for decades until you paid it off, and then people would have parties where they would burn their mortgage because they finally owned their house and they were free of the debt suffrage that they had to incur to raise their families and put their children through school and those things that we do in America, which is the middle class. They turned that situation post, quite frankly, 9/11 into a giant casino racket. So ultimately, all of the fundamentals that we used to associate with lending turned into a Ponzi scheme, a giant Ponzi scheme racket that involved all of the elements of what I just informed you of in terms of to be able to get your loan. There was underwriting, there was lenders, there was, I just mentioned underwriters, but appraisers. All of these stopgaps in the system would maintain the value of homes and neighborhoods and that sort of thing. And it all was predicated on if people worked. So what we did in this country was we replaced work with credit because we offshored that work all over the world. And so by the time you get to the late 80s into the 90s and everything else, you already had all sorts of fraudulent behavior in the housing industry. And this was news to me when I went down this path. I never knew this was even possible, because when I grew up in the 80s, it was like, okay, you know thieves, right? Somebody could go to a local 7-Eleven, they could, bring in a gun and, take a bunch of stuff, and that's pretty simple theft, right? Then you start learning about different types of schemes that happen that are white collar fraud, that are more sophisticated, but they usually make a lot of sense. In this particular case, what was insane and the brilliance of this is that we all thought that institutions, banks, anything from government, the Federal Reserve, the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, all of those types of things, of course, have credibility, because we wouldn't have people within those institutions that would ever do anything illegal. Because if they were caught, their careers would end, they'd be off in shame, and their lives would be end. So there was this ability to prevent that type of sort of incentive. But what you discover in the con, and what you discover as a result of our work that nobody has ever told the country, is that what we really ended up with in this system are what we call perverse incentives. And everything begins and ends with the CEOs who got compensated beyond your wildest comprehension to basically institute a fraud ring at every step of the way, and got away with it. And that's the
How do perverse incentives like paying CEOs far more than what would be, lucrative for a company? How does that tie into the fraud? That, because I feel like a lot of people would just see that as being excessive greed. How does that tie into the fraud?
They're actually incentivized to do it. So it comes from what's known as modern executive compensation, and that's basically the next quarter. So you're always predicated on building profits for the next quarter. And that makes sense, right? When you have a growing and a vibrant, dynamic sort of competitive marketplace, you would think that those who are the smartest and the best, that could get the best market, that have the best reputation, would get the most customers. And so therefore, that's what would actually, create the revenue that would lead to bonuses. That's not how it works. The way it works is you end up with this insane, and this is how I had to turn my world upside down, because prior to my experience in 2008, I literally thought the world worked. And think about this for everybody today, right? So you got a job. You put your clothes on, you get in your car, you expect your car to work. You go drive down to whatever your job is. You expect the stoplights to work, right? We're in this country that we expect, if we get on a plane, that we expect it to work. We don't expect all of those things to sabotage at the same time, to destroy everybody, so that some eye in the sky could get paid a lot of money to make sure everybody else got destroyed. That's beyond our comprehension. So you have to take yourself out of that, and you have to retool your mind to configure what the matrix actually really is. So through perverse incentives and modern executive compensation, what you end up with in banks is that the way they get paid is ultimately banks make loans. They get paid on lending money, either to businesses, to homes, to whatever. And the sum total of the amount of loans that they make, they get paid bonuses. So at this time period between 1990 and let's call it 2008, there was this sort of mantra on Wall Street that was called "I'll Be Gone, You'll Be Gone." The idea was get as much as you can now, at the risk of everything going sideways. Again, they call it the business cycle, but this is slightly different than the business cycle, and it will ultimately take us to why Federal Reserve Act 13.3 was illegal, but this is used illegally. But this is how they do it. So there's an actual psychological process. It's called Gresham's dynamic. And what that does is when you cheat, you win. So for example, in the late 80s, after the savings and loan crisis, Janet Yellen's husband, a guy who was also given a Nobel laureate for this work, he did this work called Lemons, Selling Lemons for Profit. And ultimately what that constituted was something very simple. On the lots of used cars, everyone started learning how to turn back the odometers, right? Because if you have the lower miles on that used car, you have a better chance of selling that car. The person who goes in doesn't know that they cheated and put it back and doesn't know all the problems that come with car, but they're going to buy it thinking that they're buying something that has less miles. So that perverts the market, okay? And that was ultimately the grift that ties into sales executives and compensation. And so ultimately what the CEOs do is they basically say to their sales staff, we need to get the most volume and you're going to be rewarded handsomely. So these sales executives would get, and they still do to this day, of course, the parking lot, the front parking lot, they get the convertible Benz. If you're in Orange County, you get to drive with the convertible down. You have the hot Bombi, what am I trying to think of? I can't even think of the, God, what is her name? Bambi. No, Bambi.
Barbie?
Barbie. I'm trying to think of Barbie. Yeah, like the
Barbie and Ken.
This envision, because most of these frauds came out of Orange County, by the way. So ultimately, you have these sales executives that are like, I hate to use this terminology, but like frat guys, right? And they're incentivized to be able to make the most loans possible. And they don't care how you do it, just fucking do it. So then suddenly a culture of deception starts happening in the marketplace. People start learning how to lie, cheat, configure things that could get more loans in the pipeline by basically coming up with different ways to get people on the hook. And so what they did was they would literally change the documentation on the loans. They would say, how much do you make, right? And then they'd say, well, okay, no problem. I'll write on this loan. I'll go back to my fix-it shop. They literally had a fix-it shop in most of these lending apparatuses, like Countrywide and AmeriQuest and everything else, where they would go and they would change what people would make on their, on their W-2s and everything else, so that they knew they could get the loans approved. And so they did this ad nauseum. Now you would think that this is just a small sort of group of, degenerates doing it. No, it was the entire culture. Okay. So literally it got so bad as they created what was known as ninja loans, no income, no asset. And there were guys literally, and I don't want to blame the victim here, but imagine you come from Mexico, you come over the border, you're an illegal alien, and you get a job in the, the fields to pick tomatoes. And then suddenly you find out, hey, I can get a loan for a house. And a lot of these guys would get big loans for houses. And that's because these brokers would loan. Now that's an extreme example of what was going on, but that happened all over the country. Okay. And that was the bottom feeding of this whole thing. And you might ask yourself, well, wait a second. Why would they do this? Why would management allow them to do this? Why would anybody want to see something so ridiculous that they know that these numbers are so out of whack that there's no way they could actually get approved for that loan? Why would they do that? Well, because everybody in the pipeline was being incentivized to do it. So the managers, the lenders, the appraisers, the CDO managers, the CDW managers, everybody was involved, was incentivized to do this. So you might ask yourself, well, wait a second, don't we have regulators? Don't we have cops? Don't we have people that look inside the banks and do this? Well, yeah, but they were getting paid to go through the revolving door to get jobs working for these banks. And that went on ad nauseum for over a decade, okay? For over a decade. And then what happened in 2008 was the whole thing collapsed. Because when you build a house on a deck of cards and you throw, freaking acid at the bottom, it's going to fucking blow up. The fraud, the criminality was insane. What we show you in the con was the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history. There were literally tens of millions of felonies. So the ultimate question becomes what, Ben?
Well, I mean, if there's tens of millions of felonies, there's a couple questions. One is like, who do you get on this case? And another thing that I'm asking myself as you're talking about these incentives, because you can say that there's an incentive for an illegal alien to get a house because that's the American dream and that's why they came here. So they were incentivized, whether they use their, bright, shiny logic or not. And then you have incentives for the business itself to, as I saw in episode 1, put false documentation down there, even sign documents. I forget what that woman's name was, but they were signing her document for her and then signed the wrong name.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that was Becky Weesey, yes.
They started putting Brenda down because they forgot her name.
Right.
So then as you're talking about these incentives, it's like, okay, if everyone is incentivized to do the wrong thing, it starts making me wonder, where did these incentives start? And are they still effective?
Of course, it's our system, Ben.
Yep.
That's what we do. So it's modern executive compensation. It's our CEOs who get paid tens of millions of dollars to have the entire vertical enterprise that we think is credible to lie, steal, and cheat their way to anything they can to show record, quarter moves and everything else, because everybody gets paid incentives to do that. Now, ultimately, in the case of 2008, what happened was the entire global economy collapsed. Now, that shouldn't be a surprise, right? Because ultimately, though, you got to understand, it wasn't just the housing industry. All of those loans were baked into derivatives, and people from around the world, municipalities, companies, pensions, you name it, invested in these operations because they provided higher yield. Everybody's chasing higher yield, right? Everybody thinks everybody else is doing underwriting, but yet everybody's chasing the tulip in the moment, the tulip mania, right? Because it's like, I got to have mine now. But when you think about pensions, really the guys, it's not the teacher in the pension that's chasing the yield. It's the money manager from whomever is managing their portfolio, which could be somebody from Goldman Sachs, for example, which in many cases was. And ultimately, they're chasing yield. They're propping it up. The bubble's going up. Modern executive compensation. I'll be gone. You'll be gone. So it's all, the Tower of Babel, and it collapses. Poof, boom. The whole world's in disarray. The money, where are we going to get it? Look at all the sound bites from that time span, right? Oh my God, the market's crashing. Oh my God, nobody, who did what? The fingers are going every which direction, right? Who's to blame? Okay. Ultimately happens, Ben?
What ultimately happens is a good question. So what ultimately happens?
Okay. So everything in our system of loaning is predicated on collateral. You loan against collateral. A lot of times you loan against assets. So, for example, your asset has to have a specific value when someone does the underwriting so you can get loans. That goes for companies, that goes for everyone, right? So the Federal Reserve had specific statutes for its purpose. Its purpose was to minimize and actually, let's just say, end all of the ups and downs of what was happening before the Federal Reserve existed. There was always a battle in this country between, starting with Jefferson and Adams, about whether or not we should have a central bank. Why? Because the colonies had just, had a revolution against central authority, right? We wanted libertarianism. We wanted distributed capitalism. We wanted everybody to have liberty and be able to explore their own way. And that has its own set of history. But the way it works with the Federal Reserve, by the time we get to the Federal Reserve, there was like 4,000 currencies, Ben, prior to the Federal Reserve coming into being. And so they had to centralize the currency, which gave us the dollar bill. They had to manage it. And then ultimately they became the lender of last resort, because the way the government had evolved to that time, it was like, look, we're an industrial powerhouse. Because again, we're talking about 1913. We'd already had the Civil War. Now we are into the robber barons and the Rockefellers and, the Carnegies and all of these like the Vanderbilts and everything else, building the infrastructure based on technology. So there was this incredible industrial engine that had capacity. It was creating jobs. It was creating collateral. It was creating what banks could lend against. And there was already a history from that in Europe, but that's what we were in this process. So they had to try to stabilize the currency, which that's why they created the Federal Reserve. Now, in the mandate of the Federal Reserve, I think everybody who's ever heard of the what is it called? From Jekyll Island, it was the story of how
the creature of Jekyll Island.
The creature of Jekyll Island, how the Federal Reserve was created. And, it was the banks, the technocrats, that decided to create the central bank for, managing. Again, like I said, you want a pilot to fly the 747. You want a captain to be able to helm the carrier. You have to have the financial system manage the financial system, right? But there has to be accountability because the founders knew that absolute power creates absolute corruption, and that's what leads to tyranny. So you have the Constitution, you have all these lies, you have all of this evolution, you have now the Federal Reserve, and its mandate was a creature of Congress. It was developed to be accountable to Congress. So therefore, when I tell you, fast forward to Alan Greenspan being mandated by Congress to manage the housing market under HOEPA statutes, and he didn't, that means he allowed the runaway train wreck of fraud to go absolutely insane based on what I'm just telling you. And so in the aftermath, what should have happened was we should have had a massive investigation into what took place. Congress should have been up the ass of the financial system. Then the DOJ and the FBI should have, with every piece of resources they have, to be able to explain to the country and the world what exactly happened. Did that happen, Ben?
No, of course not. And I'm curious, what if that would have been started? Do you think some people would be in jail? Do you think it would have really corrected the system? Just curious on your thoughts. If what you just said, what should have happened, actually happened post 2008. Also understanding the corruption that was already rife in the system, how do you think this would have went?
Well, yes, it would have prevented the people who created that disaster from creating another disaster. But then, like I just told you at the outset or the end of the savings and loan crisis, a new batch of criminals came in and created 2.0, right? So that's a different question. This battle never ends. There's never, dude, this is history. There's always going to be, this is why you have Gotham. This is why you have the idea of superheroes, right? Because sometimes fucking Penguin wins, sometimes Batman wins. He kind of goes back and forth. I mean, that's at the very base cultural level. But in terms of what should have happened, Ben, look, we had what was known as the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission. They ended up doing over 1,000 interviews. It lasted for a year, and they had incredible information. They put out, I think, a 1,200-page report on exactly what happened. Are you familiar with it, Ben?
No.
Okay, see, that's the problem.
All right.
The media never told the story of what happened. What ultimately happens, and why I said at the very outset of this, Federal Reserve Act 13.3 was used illegally, was when the entire global system was in a free fall. What happened was the Federal Reserve stepped in and said, there's all this chaos. And they go to Congress and they tell Congress, this is the trifecta. This was Hank Paulson, who was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, who was the Treasury Secretary under Bush. No different than what happened during Clinton with the CEO of Goldman Sachs, who was Robert Rubin, who was the Treasury Secretary under Clinton, who created most of these things in terms of regulation, or I should say deregulation. But ultimately what happens is him, Timothy Geithner, who was the president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, which is the most important Federal Reserve Bank in the system, and he was a regulator who was supposed to prevent all this stuff from happening, and he didn't. He ultimately becomes the Secretary of the Treasury for Obama. But before all of that happens, then we have Ben Bernanke, who steps in, got awarded yesterday for the Nobel laureate. He steps in and says, I got an idea. So there's this obscure law within the Federal Reserve statutes called Federal Reserve Act 13.3. And it's there to the lender of last resort to the United States in eras of war or famine or whatever could potentially take the entire country down. It would make sense. You'd want to be able to loan to your agricultural community to keep your country fed in a time of famine, don't you think?
Yeah, I could see the reason for that clause.
What about, if we want to keep the military running if you're fighting the Nazis, right? I mean, that's Keynesian economics, and that's how we were able to build, the United States had the 15th largest military in the world before Germany and then the Nazis. And then by World War II, we became this incredible superpower. Why? Because we turned on the freaking money to create the industrialization. Okay, so set that aside, right? That all makes sense. Would it make sense to you, Ben, and your viewers out there, to provide trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of liquidity to bankrupt, corrupt financial shadow banks that weren't even insured by FDIC regulations, who blew themselves up based on what I just told you? Do you think it says anywhere in the Constitution of the United States that the Federal Reserve would exist to pay criminals trillions of dollars for burying the American people?
No, it's got to have some oversight, and I would reckon that's Congress then, correct?
But did Congress act?
Doesn't look like it.
What they did was Ben Bernanke and John Paulson, or Hank Paulson, and Timothy Geithner went to Congress and said, if you don't give us $700 billion, the entire economy, global economy is going to collapse. I don't know why they chose that number, but that became what was known as the Troubled Assets Relief Program. So ultimately, the American people and media, think about Anderson Cooper. I like to call the guy Zoolander Cooper. He's like, oh, hey, he's asking like somebody from the Fed, how are you guys going to save the day, with absolutely no understanding of what Congress should do in the first place, not even understanding that there was this massive criminal racket that undergirded this entire system, and that Congress or the Federal Reserve was supposed to mandate, the housing market, not being aware of any of that. But anyway, he, being a Vanderbilt, which is kind of funny, paid millions of dollars a year. Same with Rachel, same with Tucker. They're like asking all the stupid questions because they don't know what the fuck just happened. And ultimately, the Federal Reserve just does an end round. We got a $7 billion TARP package approved in Congress. And that literally was like the end of the world at that time, because nobody could understand how this capitalistic engine could have the moral hazard to pay the people that blew up the economy, but they didn't know how they blew it up. And so ultimately, the Federal Reserve behind it provided $29 trillion in 2009 to these guys, and it didn't end there. It just began. Quantitative easing kicked in on November 3rd of 2010. That's what are we, 22 now? So it's 12 years. 12-year anniversary is coming up on November 3rd. They printed money into existence to keep this machine going, and we've been doing it ever since.
So what I've heard about after quantitative easing and just pumping money into the system, what did that start doing? Like, what should that start doing to the economy? And did it do that to the economy? Like, that should weaken the dollar tremendously, correct? If you just keep pumping money into the system.
Let's just start with the first question you just asked. So if you pump trillions of dollars into the economy, it should have a resonant effect, right? Like, we should have rebuilt the country 5 times over, and everybody should have a middle-class job and everything else, just like after the Great Depression.
Right.
Is that what your eyes tell you you've seen for the last 13 years?
No, I've seen no improvements. I've seen nothing in infrastructure.
It went to the billionaires and the oligarchs and the richest people in this country, based on what I just told you, which is financialization. Now get a load of this, Ben. It wasn't just 30 trillion. Now you got to understand something.
That's a breakaway civilization. That's
yes, Ben. Ben,
now we're going well.
You got to understand.
Now we're getting good.
The bottom line is that we gave another 22 trillion or more in 2019 to backstop a derivative run that nobody even knows existed. The Bank of Japan goes on this derivative crisis in 2019. This is pre-COVID, and the Federal Reserve steps up again with Federal Reserve Act 13.3. They pump another 20 trillion to backstop this derivative run. Nobody knows what the fuck actually happened there. But that's what derivatives do. And if you don't understand deregulation, you don't understand that top dogs are gambling behind the scenes with stuff that's basically sawdust for trillions of dollars that are coming from the Federal Reserve. And then that makes it look like the stock market's doing well. And then they throw it into assets. And then all of a sudden we had COVID. What happens in COVID? March 2020. March 2020 was the biggest of them all. So what it turns out to be is that I think the Fed balance sheet went from, I think in 2014, it was like $4 trillion. So you got to understand this. The Fed balance sheet was $1 billion for 100 years of its existence until 2009. I mean, it became roughly $1 trillion, through everything. by 2009. Suddenly, it pops up to 4 trillion, and now it's up to 9 trillion in a span of 13 years. You see the situation here? What I'm telling you is that the Federal Reserve is pumping trillions of dollars into criminal institutions that are using this gaming that it started with the housing crisis and is now into everything that we have. That's why they're talking about the everything bubble. And so when Jerome Powell, who was actually also guilty of insider trading with his buddy Robert Kaplan, who's out of the Dallas Federal Reserve. So you got the head of the Federal Reserve who's working with none other than BlackRock, managing his money based on inside information for his own portfolio. He's the head of the Federal Reserve. In the previous life of my life, something that insane in terms of conflict of interest would have had him like, whoa, it would have been on the front page of the New York Times, Washington Post, and him fired. That's not the way we do it anymore. The mainstream doesn't even talk about financial situation. The only ones who talk about financial situations are CNBC, and they pump and dump. They're not telling you about the fraud. And then ultimately, Fox Business and whatever else. And then, everybody else is trying to figure out what's going on. Every podcaster is like, why is the system corrupt? Who did what, when, and how? Oh, wait a second, it's an inside job. Yeah. Trillions of times bigger than you can ever possibly imagine based on what we show you in the con. And that's why we're marching on the Federal Reserve.
So I want to get into that marching on the Federal Reserve. That's in D.C. November 1st. I definitely want to get into that. I want to touch base upon a couple other things. Like, for one, when a heist or a fraud is that big, Gordon, who was that? Was it Herman Goering who said, or was it Goebbels who said, to basically, if you want to do something illegal, you make it so big that nobody would believe that it happened.
No, he was exactly right. That's exactly right. That's the whole third right.
The bigger you make it, the harder it is for people to wrap around.
Lie infinitum. And by the way, yes, dude, listen, again, a lot of libertarians, for example, right? So if you think about the political construct of the United States right now, we're in disarray, right? So before I get to this point, though, I do want to point this out in terms of the march. So what we're trying to do, what I'm doing, in fact, it's very important for your listeners out there to believe what I'm telling you, because I think I've been targeted. You never thought of myself as a paranoid guy ever, but I've discovered certain things recently that are just like, oh my God, you got to be kidding me. And it's because I've been talking about Federal Reserve 13.3. I'm telling you, nobody in the goddamn country, in media, politics, or elsewhere, has ever mentioned this to anyone. I'm the only person that's saying this, so therefore, I'm the only one you can trust, because this is the emperor's new clothes on really bad acid. Ultimately, what is going on, what we're trying to do is that many, many millions of homeowners got train wrecked by this system based on fraud. That same fraud existed in the courts. In the judiciary, we saw millions of foreclosures. They were fraud closures. They were built and predicated on securities that the foreclosing entities, which we call foreclosure mills or servicers, they never had the note or standing, which they could not bring a foreclosure case because they weren't owned what they claim are in the courts. The courts just basically looked the other way, and just because they were getting paid by quantitative easing through this whole process, to basically, Timothy Geithner famously said in 2009, the American people are foam on the runway for the crashing financial system. I to this day don't understand who would want to be foam on the runway standing in front of a crashing 747. Does that sound like a pleasant experience? Yet nobody in America ever reacted to that. Although we did have the Occupy Wall Street movement, but they didn't know, they didn't realize the fraud of what I'm talking about, nor did they understand the regulation and all the things that got changed because of, this inside collusion and corruption with our government that enabled all of this to happen. So in the end, you have all of these people that got destroyed, their lives, homeless people, whatever. They got ground out in the courts, divorces, suicides, you name it. The suffering is insane. We're gathering them in front of the Federal Reserve on the 10-year anniversary of quantitative easing to chase to the world we were the foam on the runway for the crashing financial system, and we're real. And the bottom line is, I'm going to put together all of the top people who know this business inside and out, and there's this movement afoot right now. I'm seeing it over and over and over. People are asking questions about quantitative easing. What was quantitative easing? It wasn't just stimulating trillions of dollars into the economy through these broker dealers, which we call primary broker dealers, which are the too big to fail banks. They also bought assets, and they bought toxic assets, which were supposedly the foam on the runway, that top dollar baked on appraisal fraud that went into creating the collateral that they loaned again. It's all smoke and mirrors, man. And they put all of these notes on the books of Fannie and Freddie, which are quasi government sponsored enterprises that are in solvency, that are basically, hiding this information. The long of the short is, it's the largest criminal racket in history, and it's not rocket science, it's racketeering.
What you were just explaining there would be stock buybacks, correct?
Among
others. Was that money laundering? Is that what you said?
That's part of it. Oh, by the way, I did want to say that I'm getting fucked with on social media. So, for example, I did this what's it called, TikTok video the other day, where I just basically said Federal Reserve Act 13 is illegal, just like I've been saying on your show. We had like over 70,000 views in probably less than a week, and they just took it off.
Is that right?
I'm not saying fuck you, fuck this, I'm starting a revolution. I'm not doing anything like that. He said Federal Reserve Act 13.3 was illegal. I'm telling you, if you thought, for example, it was huge, this is trillions of times bigger than Watergate. Now I'm going to bring it full circle to the presidential election, everything else. Listen, Ben, dude, we got a nuclear war potentially cooking, right? Vladimir Putin, as of yesterday, we had missile attack 50 cities throughout Ukraine. This is because they blew up this bridge in Crimea, and then ultimately you've got the scenario where Putin is like losing it. I think a lot of people thought Putin was losing it for a long time, but now he's threatening, some sort of limited nuclear war. On top of that, you've got the Saudis and Russia and China now involved with what they're calling OPEC plus. It's really Saudi and Russia, but China is a big part of that. Now, the dollar bill is inextricably linked to the petrodollar. So we replaced gold backstopping the dollar back in 1971 after Bretton Woods, because we couldn't finance, our campaign in Vietnam and then keep up the guns and butter situation, because we were trying to, end poverty at that time too, because that was part of the civil rights. So we basically financed the whole thing, right? So ultimately that created the inflation that led to all of the stuff that Volcker's dealing with. So that would set that aside for that lesson, right? And then we get into the A's. What we're dealing with right now, insane, because what happens, Ben, if the petrodollar suddenly goes poof, and the United States currency is no longer the world's reserve currency under these circumstances I've just mentioned, given Putin being itchy trigger on a nuclear response? What do you think happens given how much is tied to the dollar, given what I just told you?
Global energy crisis, new top dog. I mean, do you see that as an option? Even Putin understanding, where that goes. Do you actually see that as an option or a threat?
I don't know, but this has been going on for a long time, and it's not sustainable. I mean, look, dude, we could have think about it. I think we've literally sank over $50 trillion of this calamity vis-a-vis the Federal Reserve since 2009. Could $50 trillion have gone to reboot the United States so that we weren't on, like the precipice every time oil goes up and down the way it does?
Absolutely, but there's one clause in that. It would not have gone towards the false propping up that it needed to in order for, so the propping up of these companies that should have failed, even though they were called too big to fail. And that would have caused something that I can't quite yet see. Like, I don't know where we'd be at if we would have taken the money that we dumped in, you said 50 trillion, and actually just built infrastructure with it. I don't know what that would have done to all those banks and all those businesses there, other than they,
what should have
they
happened
just
with the bank
crumble.
Supposed to happen, and it has happened a lot, but not to this level. Those banks go insolvent, dude. That's all there is to it. Yeah. They go insolvent. You throw the bad guys in jail for racketeering. You just basically should have been all over the front pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, Chicago, Tribune, Miami Sun Herald, whatever, man. The LA Times. But it wasn't, because everybody played ball, because what they all got the message. And this is another reason I know this. This came recently because I happened to watch over the weekend, and it just came to my attention. What's it called? Oh my gosh, Frontline on PBS. Frontline on PBS does some really great investigative journalism. In fact, many people in my industry consider them the gold standard. And I've always wondered why they had been so close to a bunch of things that I knew and I had to go find myself to put into the con, but they never resolved and they never revealed. Now, one thing is that obviously PBS is funded by government, so there's that. But the other side of the equation was, they just kept missing the most important questions, right? So suddenly I find out that they did a documentary series, and we're all, just absorbed or overwhelmed with so much information that we can't keep up with stuff that we're actually even interested in. That's how much information's out there, right? And so the Frontline did a series called Wall Street, Power, and Money, and it was released just last year, 2021. I didn't even know it, but I watch it because I watch these things because I want to see what other people have to say and what they did. And I was always kind of wondering where Frontline was post, let's call it 2015. What they did was ultimately a mea culpa, where they tried to get all of the information that I'm telling you into a synergy, because I'm pretty sure that they discovered the con and studied the con, and government needed to have a response to keep this subdued. I think what they did, based on what I watched, and I couldn't believe it, was they get so close to making you think that government had no choice but to do what it did, based on your question. So what you're inferring is, if you don't provide the liquidity to keep these fraudulent institutions whole, the whole world goes in collapse. Now that's true, because the financial system basically pointed a gun at their head and then said, don't come after me or I'll shoot. Right? They played roulette with the global economy, and they got away with it. But that's not the way it should have happened. The way it should have happened, Ben, is the whole country, for a country that supposedly no man is above the law or no company is above the law, they should have done the investigation that we had to do with the con. And if you watch the con, you'll see that we have the FBI, DOJ, the SEC, and the AGs around the country. And oh, by the way, I found the only RICO conviction of this story in the entire country, which is a miracle, through the tragedy of Addie Polk, who had to put a gun to her chest, pull the trigger 5 times to commit suicide as a 91-year-old African-American widow who was being thrown in the streets because they were stealing her house. This whole thing was financial terrorism. So in our country, after 9/11, did we supposedly want to whitewash terrorism or go after bin Laden? Whatever. We ended up with Iraq, and fucking Saudi Arabia didn't get nailed. And then, maybe we got bin Laden, whatever. The bottom line is that we never took out the bad guys, and the bad guys run the show. So if we want to live in the, corrupt states of America, that the citizens are the United Suckers of America, then that's a choice we got to make, right? But I'm not that guy. I'm a guy that believes in liberty and justice for all. I believe the system works, and if you hold the bad guys to account, then the good guys have a chance to win. Now, obviously, that's not the perfect situation, but it's a whole lot better than winding up with fascism, because ultimately what happens, and this is the way it always works.
And something else that I just wanted to add that I think is important, and I want to know if you agree with this, Patrick, is I actually studied monetary policy in college, and I worked at Merrill Lynch for a little bit right out of college, and then realized this, being within the beast, going, oh, this is super fucked up. They make it complicated on purpose, et cetera, et cetera. But something that I realized is that they knew that they were not going to be held to accountable, and they knew that they had no accountability. They could act this way knowing that they would be bailed out, knowing that they would have this ability to leverage, basically saying, we're too big to fail, knowing, I'm not explaining this as adept as I want, but you see what I'm saying? The incentives, we have to change the incentives within the system to get a different outcome. And I think a lot of people don't think that the system is really truly rigged. I think more and more they are, but it is no surprise when you have these incentives that you have these kind of actions, but especially when these actions are so unaccountable, and when they know that they literally are able to act in this gambling type way because there's no repercussions.
You just freaking nailed it. And what I'm blown away by is, how did everybody in Merrill know that they weren't going to be held accountable?
It wasn't like anything said openly, but I learned once I got out of Merrill, looking at the larger players and the Geithner and the revolving door, that because of this culture, because of this inbreeding within public and private sector, that's going back all the way to really, I'd say, the 40s and the formation of the Wall Street bankers with intelligence communities and the formation of what's called the deep state, the Dulles types and all these guys. This was basically a long-withstanding policy within the higher ups, but the lower, I'm a small, lowly financial advisor. We're just part of the, 80% attrition rate that is constantly cycled in. But the people who make it to the very top, you started to realize that there's a certain culture and ideology, just like within manufacturing consent, within media, within finance, it's the same thing. You're rewarded, you're incentivized to play ball with these unethical type actions. And I realized that early on, I just saw glimpses of it, but it was fucking disgusting, and I didn't want to be a part of it. But I didn't want, I realized we had to figure out what's going on. Well, how do we have a free market? How do we figure out a new way? But this isn't the way.
You just made my day. Thank you for saying that, because you know what? You just put an exclamation point, for a moment there. And I apologize to you, Ben. I mean, I sometimes get carried away because I'm so passionate about this stuff. But I thought, God, man, am I getting too in the weeds here? Am I trying to assert myself too much? And then suddenly, here he comes with this nuclear revelation that the culture knew that they weren't going to be held accountable. So America, wise the fuck up. This is how it works. Because I was in a fraternity, for example, right? I know how bad dudes operate sometimes, and I was always a good dude. And be honest with you, I learned everything I knew on the playground by the time I was in third grade. Every time a bully tried to fucking talk shit, I knocked them the fuck out in front of everybody. That's what I do. That's how I've always done it. That's my DNA. So how does that translate to, many years later? So that culture you just talked about, that's a rape culture. So you get a bunch of dudes together, you get them all hopped up on cocaine and whatever else, and they get a couple of rupees and they invite a bunch of chicks over, and then they gang rape the living hell out of her, and they throw in the garbage. Should we let those guys get away with it?
No.
Should they be held to account? That's the point. If you got the law, then you put these guys in jail. That's what the Department of Justice is. The Department of Justice and the FBI and the SEC has a sum total budget of $70 billion a year. Do you think I had $70 billion to get this thing done? Not fucking remotely. Now, the bottom line is that I'm telling you guys over and over, and I want the world to understand this because they're coming after me, man. Or they're coming after this message. And I don't know what's going to happen next, but it's the real deal. And I think they suppressed me, by the way. The con never wound up on Netflix or on HBO, and it's pretty easy to see why. BlackRock is the largest shareholder of Netflix. HBO had a huge merger and acquisition last year with Time Warner, where it was Goldman and Chase. We reveal how all of those guys operate. Now, the one thing that I want to leave your viewers with too, because I haven't gotten to this, and I could talk for hours and hours, as you can tell, but you need to be aware that before. Okay, the timing was in 2007. Bear Stearns was a house of cards. There's literally a book by guys in my film who was a writer for the New York Times and the Atlantic and everything else. He's one of the kingpins of journalism on Wall Street. Wrote a book called House of Cards. And ultimately, what happened was the financial system, Geithner and Paulson and Bernanke had met with all of the 13 heads of the banks to try to save what would ultimately become this global contagion that led to Lehman Brothers and everything else. And between that time and some stuff that happened right after Lehman, basically they created this 3-page configuration that said, banks are going to do it this way, and you're going to shut up, and you're going to do it exactly as I tell you, and no questions, you're going to play ball is what they did, and that's what led to this $29 trillion. But that all started with what was known as Maiden Lane. Now, Maiden Lane is, interestingly enough, a street that's right next to Liberty Street, which is where the Occupy Wall Street movement happened, down in South Manhattan, okay? So it's all there in this paradox that this whole thing went down. And they figured out that what we're going to do is we're going to provide the system that's blown up the world with trillions of dollars to hide. So to his the idea that everybody knew that we're going to be bailed out. Think about this. It's a gang rape of unbelievable magnitude. And so you can't, the thing that you got to be careful of in these situations. And by the way, BlackRock, that was my point. BlackRock was chosen to be the administrators of this program. That's where Larry Fink became the king of the world. Did anybody vote for Larry Fink to be the king of the world? Was that on the ballot? No. Larry Fink became the cleanup man. Now, interestingly enough, Larry Fink was the cleanup man after the S&L crisis. He came in to create what they had, Resolution Trust. That's what they did this, and they moved on, right? But it was like 1/180th the size of the great financial crisis, and whatever's coming next is probably going to make the financial crisis look small, which is just, we're talking in times if that's the case. The long and the short of it is that's how they got trillions of dollars of liquidity. They were the ones that were operating the so-called bazooka that Paulson was talking about that time. And ultimately, look around, man. Who's the world's largest asset manager? It's fucking BlackRock. And BlackRock has their hands in everything from entertainment to oil to governments and everything else. They're the shadow force that you might have been talking about previously, which is the deep state. They might be hand in hand with CIA as far as I know. In fact, I talked to a guy recently who has served in Congress for 30 years, and I postulated that question. I said, hey, man, if everybody knows all of this stuff is going on, where's the CIA? And where do you think? So,
they're part of it.
There is a state. And
Big
so
club.
the final thing I'll say about it is Donald Trump has been now made because I think the con is out there. And by the way, you remember how Donald Trump is in the mix right now for a documentation fabrication with the elector certification with none other than Mr. Rico himself, the vampire Rudy Giuliani? Where do you think he got the idea to do that stuff? The freaking housing collapse. The housing, because he owned Trump mortgages. His people were lying and deceiving on these mortgages. So it's like, and also, dude, it brings a full circle. Dude, look, it's insanity. It's insanity. But emperor's new clothes on really bad asset. If you want to end the global gang rape by a tiny sliver of the population, you got to get the facts, and you have to have the truth. And I'll finish. I said I've finished like 3 times, but I gotta share my human experience. Okay. So when that shit went down in 2008, right? I've got my son. He's like 3 years old at the time. I'm into my new house. I've got my wife. I was living the American Dream 101. Suddenly, all of my income, because the show I was working on collapsed. Remember I told you that the CEO of this, our EP, they were flying on G5s one day, G4s one day, and then suddenly they're bankrupt. Okay, that was the first wave that hit me. Then the tidal wave was coming. Next thing I know, I'm caught up in this, and I don't have any of this information. I don't know anything about anything. I just know I got sucker punched. It led me to climbing up on a mountain. I was sitting there on this cliff because there was nothing I could do. It was the first time in my life that I felt absolutely powerless. And I sat there and I was just, okay, and I'm a skier and I'm a snowboarder and I've been an action sport athlete my whole life. I know how to send it. That's what we say in my culture. When you're ready to fucking launch, you send it. And so I sat up on that cliff and I was doing the countdown. I'm going to send it. I'm going to disappear. My life means nothing. Nothing means anything. Fuck it. I'm gone. And then I sat up there, and in that moment, I made a fucking, I made an agreement. I said to myself, to the higher power, to the universe, to whatever it is, I said, I'm going to get to the bottom of this, and I'm going to find out what they did. And I did. And I'm the only guy in the country who has all the information and the access to everyone who could fix this thing if only millions of you understood the facts. You're about to get buried again. They're going to pull the plug on a lot of jobs because they're blaming inflation on jobs to cover their ass so they can get quantitative easing again to the richest amongst us. That's called tyranny. If you're an American and you believe in liberty and justice for all and the dynamics of freedom, you cannot allow this betrayal to go on any further. Join us. There is a peaceful resolution to do this, and it's the investigation that the con reveals. We just need millions of people to get it so that we can turn the tables on this madness.
Indeed. Indeed. Yeah, dude, thank you for putting it out there. And dude, like, obviously we can sense the passion, the personalization of this story through your life, but also kudos on how far you got on it. Actually, how and please, for those listening, watch The Con. it's not only really well made, but it's very well thought out and written. And you were the writer as well.
Yeah, with my colleague Eric Vaughn, who was the director.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and really, I mean, like, I would say, like, the last question that I want to get to, I know you basically just laid out this is the solution. It's already laid out, but it's not evenly distributed, really. Like those would-be audience members out there, they don't really have the facts, as you're saying. And this is why on November 1st you're going to be at the DC Federal Reserve Building, correct?
Yeah, we're going to have hopefully a lot of people representing the Poor People's Campaign, because there's a lot of folks that were victims of the housing collapse in the African American community, and that's where this thing started, and then it engulfed everybody else. And also groups from these housing groups. But I'm also going to have an online rally, and we'll release that soon. And I'm going to have all the top dogs who have all of this information to make it even clearer. And by the way, you can see the con at www.thecon.tv. And the solution. Dude, Ben, this is really what it comes down to and what we showed in the con. After the Great Depression, we put in charge of a massive investigation into what created the Great Depression, a gentleman by the name of Ferdinand Pecora. Ferdinand Pecora was a Sicilian immigrant. He came here. He was one of those bootstrap Italian immigrants that got himself through law school, and he ended up in Tammany Hall. Now, anybody who knows American history knows that Tammany Hall was riddled with corruption back at that time period. And he also came from Sicily, so he understood the mob. He understood fraud, okay? So he wasn't a finance expert, but he understood fraud. And so what happened was, at the tail end of the Hoover administration and prior to the Federal Reserve getting into high gear to save that particular era, Ferdinand Pecora did a high-profile investigation. And because there was 25% unemployment at the time, there was Hoover camps in the middle of Central Park and all over the country, it ended up overwhelming the airwaves. And so all of media covered this. And what Ferdinand Pecora did was he revealed all of the freaking games and it was the crimes that Wall Street was doing that led to the Great Depression. And that ultimately led us to get Glass-Steagall, which separated commercial banking from investment banking, which kills the casino. And then we got the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Securities and Exchange Act, which are the police of this situation. So just like you can't sell deceptive acts and products in your store, like if you sell poison, you're going to go to jail for murder. If you're the financial system, all of these things regulate you so that if you sell toxic assets, you're going to go to prison. Presumably, that didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned then on November 5th, if people want to show up, or I'm sorry, November 1st, if people are in the area and want to show up, how can they engage? How do they get the info on when to show up? What is this going to look like? Because I'll be there.
Yeah, we're putting out all that information, and you can definitely take a look on. I'm trying to think where it begins and ends on that information. We get it out all the time. I mean, we've got on Facebook. You can check me out, but you can go to the con.tv website. It's not on that site. We are distributing it through a whole bunch of different activists, and I'm trying to think of the one-stop source that's an easy website to get to. Look, I'm all over TikTok at Patrick Lovell Truth Bombs the Con. I'm on YouTube at Patrick Lovell Truth Bombs on YouTube. And, we're working with all these different groups. The way it's scheduled right now is that we've worked with the Park Service to get the permits, and it's a peaceful protest, guys. This is no insurrection. We're having all the victims show up. Nobody's showing up with clubs and billy clubs and trying to invade Congress. What we're doing is we're trying to bring attention to the Federal Reserve. And, we'll probably start, there's going to be some teach-ins the night before, but I know for a fact that, it's like 10 o'clock at, that sounded like Modest Yahoo. Was it?
No, I just pulled up TikTok. Actually, it was. That was a great snipe. Yeah. I was trying to find your TikTok.
King without a crown, man.
It was two notes.
So ultimately, the information, the Federal Reserve be there. We're trying to get the permits, but at the same time, the Park Service have been kind of befuddling us. I think they really got high levels of since what happened in the insurrection. And that's why I think they're shutting down my stuff on TikTok. I don't know for sure, but if you get this message, you can find me easily on all social media, and then you can get the information, and I'll turn you on to all other information. PM me if you're activist groups and you're vectored to all those sorts of other things and you want to end corruption. Please, we've got to do this together. The only way we're going to end corruption is if millions of us know the truth.
I love it, man. I love it. And very last question, man. What is next on the horizon for you? If none of this shit was happening, if you didn't have to get to the bottom of this very, very unfortunate situation, what would you be doing?
Well, it's ironic that you should say that. I'm in the final stages of I'm working. Actually, I'm saying I probably can't reveal this stuff. I'm involved with some major cover-ups. Look, the entire situation for the last 20 years has been this massive smash and grab. Dude, I think most of us understand, 17th century imperialism. I think we understood what the monarchs of England and Spain and France were doing all around the world, and ultimately how that whole thing works. And lesser known is ultimately the machine that made that happen. So, for example, in England, it's the East India Trading Company, and ultimately the Parliament was acting like, quite frankly, the oligarchs. And so it was like smash and grab in colonial territories, right? Basically, the way it works in Africa and around the world is that you take over, you get your military there, you get them trading in your currency, you let them go bankrupt, and then you get all of their raw materials. That's how imperialism works. That's what this thing has done on a global scale. That's why I'm really interested to see what happens next between Saudi Arabia and the BRIC countries, because I think they're trying to make a move away from the dollar. And I think that could lead to Armageddon. Honestly, that would be the reason Armageddon went to tripwire.
Well, that's what I'm seeing as well. I'm also seeing that, there's this South Asian poly crisis, where we are exporting, not just with the energy crisis over there, but as we're exporting our inflation because our dollar is so strong.
Right.
True. What I'm seeing is the same thing. And it's funny, I was just interviewing Adam Baratta. He made this book called The Great Devaluation, and he was basically saying, Jerome Powell just came out recently and said we're now really considering CBDCs, the central bank digital currencies, and how this could be a big blow to China, to Russia, to the BRICS countries. I'm just really curious about this because he brought up some very interesting stuff as far as it seems like Russia wiped out a lot of debt by linking. He brought the ruble. He linked the ruble with gold, and he lowered the gold price, and that caused a lot of different countries to go there to buy the gold, which brought the ruble up. And it was interesting that you were mentioning, I think it was 1945 to 1960. We had this deal where we would hold the reserve currencies, but if you, as another country, if you wanted, we would give you the gold instead of the cash. Yeah. In 1971, Nixon closed the gold window, basically took us off the gold standard, and you couldn't do that anymore. That's the exact year that the World Economic Forum started as well. And so now it's this interesting thing that we can do with the dollar is punish other countries because the world, and especially oil, the reserve currency is the dollar. And this is the way that we could be the top dog. And that's what that's what everyone who's looking at this seems to be seeing is like, what was Putin's underlying point behind all of this?
Look, I was asking those questions, how many months ago now? Let's see, was it February of 2021 that they invaded Ukraine?
No, that was this year, 2022. February of this year.
It was February of this year. Okay, yeah. What am I talking about? That's what I meant to say, by the way. Yeah, I can't. Dude, the last 20 years seems like a blur, right?
It feels like it's been a year since it started.
Exactly.
So,
yeah. But because we fill our minds with these incredible these paradoxes and these dominoes and everything else. And to your point about the gold standard. It was France and de Gaulle that sent a battleship to the waters off the coast of the United States to say, I want my gold back. That happened right before Bretton Woods. Just, the Americans like, okay, France, whatever. But the bottom line is look, dude, it's been 70 years, this thing that's getting more and more out of control. And we all know what it is. It's neoliberalism. Okay. Neoliberalism is when you get, like, for example, the Chicago, school and Friedman were all experimenting with what was going on down in South America with basically privatization. So that was the precursor to a lot of the stuff. And then all of these frauds happened. So where are we now? Well, it's interesting that the brick companies, because no matter what, it's the oligarchs that are in control of everything. It's just who's going to be in control. And what I'm trying to say is, fuck them all. Right now, why do we want to be over a barrel? Why do we want to be, kissing the ass of a bunch of lying, hypocritical douchebags that fucking tell us how the world should be run when we know that they're pissing on our heads, telling us it's rain? They must have thought we were some kind of new fool. And guess what? We've been acting like fools the whole time. If you understand how these bastards get away with this stuff, we have a shot to we got to take care of business home first. That's what I'm afraid of, because if we don't take care of business first, this whole thing tripwires around the world, and you got a global calamity for a bunch of kings or pharaohs. And see, my whole thing is, it doesn't matter if it's Pharaoh, the king, a dictator, or BlackRock. The outcome's the same.
Yeah, this is true. This is
Same
true.
mentality.
So I mean, I guess just the very last thing to land on is what does that look like, taking care of business at home first, seeing as we are so intimately tied economically, imports, exports, oil, the reserve currency of the world. What does that look like, taking care of us first?
There's a lot of more smart people than me, but let's just say, for example, I lead a sort of populist movement where millions of people suddenly are listening to me because I've got a lot more information than what I've just laid on you now. And I've got a lot of contacts to people that know a lot more than I do, as do you. And your stuff is fantastic. And kudos to you guys for all the great people that you bring on. I learn something every time I listen to you guys. We have to get control of the USS Titanic. Maybe you should have said the USS Enterprise.
Yeah.
I mean, I could, for example, Star Trek work out in the long run? I'm not the kind of person that wants to levy my ideology and my persuasions of anything on anyone. I want the system to work so I have the freedom to go learn and live my life and reform when I need to, find a way when I need to, whatever. That's the United States that I grew up with, right? I mean, you and I come out of the era where it was punk rock, anarchy. What did that mean in the context of what led to, electronic and blah, blah, blah. Music was always the soul of this culture that brought us into this sort of mix where we got to mix it up with people of different persuasions, but the light still worked. The plane still worked. I could still make some money somehow. If I want to go, grow some dope and do whatever. I mean, there's ways people can make money, right? There's ways the system can work to where it's not controlled by these unbelievable denizens of disaster. Listen, whether it's 9/11 in the fossil fuel industry, whether it's 2008 in the financial industry, whether it's Putin in World War III, I'm telling you, it's all the sociopathic sort of, I'm going to destroy everybody else so I can maintain my power.
Yeah.
What the fuck? We're the masses. We got to fucking overwhelm them. They have overwhelmed us. And the only way that they have been able to do it is when people are not citizens, when they're chattel. The difference between the United States and the rest of the world is we have inherited the ability to be citizens, and that the sand is running out of the hourglass. This is our last chance, man.
Yeah, I feel you. And I definitely feel like there's something that comes in times of great absurdity. We're pushed past the level of thinking in the old paradigm or with the old model, when things become so absurd, which honestly, politics has always looked like a soap opera to me.
Absolutely.
Mainstream media has always looked like a soap opera to me. And the mystery has always been, how do other people get sucked so deeply into it without realizing that this is just theater?
You know the answer to that, Ben. You know the answer because they're too busy trying to survive.
Well, exactly. And I also had to come to the realization that people aren't looking for truth. They're looking for safety. They're trying to take care of the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If they feel safe, they will parrot any line that just makes them feel like they're part of the group. You know, then they'll jockey for positions inside the herd. Like, yeah, I'd love to be the alpha in the herd. But those on the fringe, there's few of us. And those on the fringe are those that are like, you know what, I'm going to step outside of the herd because something else is going on. And I would say those that step outside the herd are the ones that are actually looking for truth. Like, whoa, there's something so much more fundamental happening here. And I had to come to the realization that unless things get absolutely absurd in front of our eyes, like nothing makes sense. And the whole idea of disinformation, misinformation, in a sense, you could say, oh, that's a bad thing. Or, you know, I honestly think if things are getting this absurd, something needs to push people into being like, wait a minute, I feel like I'm living in the Truman Show. Like something is not right here.
They are. Everybody walked into the casino and they sat down at the table, and the entire casino and that table was there to basically steal from them. That's the point. Yeah. And by the way, Gordon is who nailed it earlier, right? What did Gordon tell us? I mean, Gordon absolutely freaking nailed it, right? I think out of everything that I said, the thing I'm most taken away from, but you and you too, of course, but when Gordon said, we all knew that we weren't going to be held accountable.
Mm-hmm.
That, dude, what I've known my whole life is if you let a Nazi get away with fucking murdering somebody, are they going to stop murdering somebody?
Yeah.
No.
The ideology doesn't go away.
But not everybody was a Nazi, but the idea of those close to the
system.
I mean, 70 million people, 50 to 70 million people died in World War II. That gave us, you know, a renaissance in our lifetime, only to go back to, you know, look, guys, this is yin and yang. This is history. This is how it goes. This is darkness. This is light. What I keep telling people, and my whole thing is, bro, and you can take it to the bank, man. The sons and daughters of the light have got to defeat the fucking denizens of disaster, the fucking darkness. That's all they are, man. That's all those son of a bitches are. There's people that work in a Merrill with Gordon. Hey, you know what? They're not going to stop us, so fuck it. Why wouldn't you?
Mm.
It's not until you step up and you knock them the fuck out that they stop. And I'm saying that metaphorically.
Just like the bully on the playground, but metaphorically. I feel you.
Yeah, and I'll say this too, just to kind of steel man a little bit of like people who work within government that are good people who work within finance that are good people. A lot of times, and I was one of these people, you're sold on the lies. You're sold on the BS. You're sold. I'm Gordon Gekko. Like, I bought into it. I bought into that ideology. It's sexy. It's fun. It's cool. You get women. There's a lot of incentives superficially and materialistically that incentivize you. But ultimately, at the soul level and at the fulfillment level, deep down, I knew it was deeply flawed. And I just realized it earlier than a lot of other people. But I saw people later down the line who were that way, but they were too vetted. They were too invested. They had the wife. They had the mortgage. And I was like, I got to get out while I can, because I don't want to end up like him. He's wealthy as shit, but he's dating some 26-year-old who hates him and doesn't love him for his, personality. So it's all these ideas of wanting to feel connected, to wanting to feel accomplished, to wanting to feel like you're an achievement in society. But society and all those stories, a lot of the times, they're not going to lead to your true happiness. And they're created by these same people so that you stay this consuming, fear-based little good pawn within this system. But more and more that's breaking loose. More and more, especially the younger generation, they're seeing through the lies immediately. They're not brought up in the conditioning as much in the 1990s sort of ideology of Wall Street and burn, 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 baby. And now with internet and information and digitalization and decentralization, people are so aware and awake, especially within the millennial and younger, but they're just extremely frustrated, and they're going, okay, so what's next? What's the plan? What's going to replace this? Because we know it's fucked up. We've heard enough Russell Brands. We've heard all these people saying, all right, Rogan, we know, like, welcome to the club, but what's next? What do we do? How do we unite in a loving way to get real change to occur, to change it systemically and not just tertiary and not just on the surface level? Because they're ready, they're hungry, they're thirsting for all these things, and they know they bought into a lot of the bullshit Rothschild snake oil type stuff. But what's next? That's this whole precipice point that we're on, that community is ready for.
You nailed it. And Ben and Gordon, thank you for the opportunity to riff with you guys, man. Because again, a couple of prescient points here, right? First of all, I love Russell Brand. he doesn't have a clue about what I just laid on you guys for the last 2 hours. He doesn't know the mechanics. He's a comedian and he's a good guy and he's a smart guy and he's the greatest orator I think maybe I've ever heard, but he doesn't know the ingredients of control fraud because he doesn't know policy, he doesn't know the law, and he doesn't know what actually happened to create this world that he wants to create, this so-called, a great awakening. How can you create a great awakening without knowing exactly what the fuck is going on? So that's first and foremost. Joe Rogan, God, I used to love Joe Rogan. Now Joe Rogan, I'm not sure what I think about Joe Rogan except for everything everybody else is talking about. But again, I tried to get on Joe Rogan's show a bunch of times. I dealt with it, they don't want to tell the story. Okay, I'm telling you, nobody wants to tell the story. Everybody has gotten right up to the point where it's like, we can talk about things in this sort of ethereal way, and yet we can't tell you exactly why Federal Reserve Act 13.3 allowed the system to steal trillions of dollars to backstop a murderous, freaking corrupt criminal apparatus. Okay, that's basically high on crack the whole time. So the systemic problem, guys, it's like cancer. You've got to fucking deal with the tumor, man. So what you deal with, and it's a brain tumor, it's a fucking cultural tumor, it's all the rest. Now, what is then the prescription though of the when you go under chemo, right? Well, you're not trying to kill the body, you're trying to kill the tumor. You got to use the truth to overcome this insane, everything from Donald Trump to Fox to Rachel Maddow to who's everybody's favorite, Alex Jones. Alex Jones got paid $50 million a year to buy his fucking ass off, right? Okay, so the bottom line is you got to have the truth. The truth has got to overcome the lies. And you only do that is with facts and evidence. That's our system. That's what we have. That's what we have, soup to nuts. If you have millions of your generation, Gordon, and younger, right? Because my generation, for some reason, Ben, what happened to our people? What happened to them, dude? Why are they so paralyzed? Why are they so like, I can't do anything, so I'm not going to do anything? They're either bought so far into it or they're just so beat down. Those are the only two scenarios. The young people coming up have got to realize how bad it is. They got to realize that the only way to get the power back is to get the power back. Your entire system was created as a revolution to tyranny. We have to have a revolution to tyranny. Now, what form does that take? Back in the 30s, right? What happened throughout the world? We had the Great Depression, destroyed everything. Hitler was pretty much paralyzed until the Great Depression. When the Great Depression hit, Hitler was off to the races. By the way, so was Stalin. Regardless of what you think about ideology, both of them murdered shit tons of people. That's how they fucking got power. That's how they brutalized it until they killed each other. And then we had a role and we picked up a lot of the pieces. I'm not trying to discount our role in World War II. It was huge. It wasn't as monumental as the Soviets, let me tell you. They lost 20 million people fighting fucking Hitler, okay?
26 million.
26 million, all right? It was significant, right? It was in trenches. It was like hand-to-hand. It was like rip your face off kind of shit. It was the worst of the worst, and they survived that, right? That's what's coming unless we don't get a hold of this shit. Why? Because it's history. It's the way it works. It's the way it's always worked. I think we're smarter than that. I think if we had the facts, we could do what we did. The reason why the United States didn't go the way of fascism or communism is because we had the Pecora hearing that got the facts and we cleaned up the business that gave us a handful of years, but then we won World War II. So there's that. I don't know what the future holds. All I know is liberty and justice for all has got to matter.
And I'll just say this, just two little points that came up there, Patrick, is the one thing I think is critical with the millennial generation is younger is we're experiencing it so viscerally compared to the boomer generation that really, I think, not to make this ageist, and I'm not in any way doing that, but just there's a very different contextual environment with finances during the 90s and during the booming of all these things. We're now at this stage, timing wise, of it being late stage of the bubble hitting these precipice points where it's starting to pop, student loans, all these things.
Everything.
And the other point, yeah, and the other key point about Rogan, Russell Brand, these various figures who will go to this edge, because I see it exactly, and I'm very much in this zeitgeist too, is there's either one, an extreme fear to go that far because they don't want to be labeled a conspiracy theorist, or two, because they don't legitimately think it is a real conspiracy. They think it is just a natural emergence, a natural phenomenon of capitalism, or this sort of just general people are selfish.
Exactly. They don't have the facts. The facts are in the con. But I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you're absolutely right. And again, I got to just say it again. The con, www.thecon.tv. It's the fucking show that BlackRock doesn't want you to see. Please continue.
I mean,
that's
should be
it.
the slogan for the show.
That's it. I mean, because Yeah. I mean, people are afraid to be stratified. You know, they're afraid to be kicked, to be seen as weird. And, oh, you sound like an Alex Jones type person, right? You need to have a serious amount of evidence when you're making serious accusations and extravagant claims, which you do. And I totally get it, because for people, there's such extreme cognitive dissonance. Like, this is probably one of the most extreme cognitive dissonance things up there with, like, you know, extraterrestrial life. But these are my lanes, because why is there so much cognitive dissonance? You know, why is there so much fear around this being true? Because if the implications of this means the amount of lying and corruption and darkness and effed up things that had to have occurred without us knowing, it's so hard for people to accept. Even if it's true, they don't want to accept it. There's a psychological element too that's just really hard for people to, depending where they're at in life, psychologically, to even accept this, even if they know it's true.
Can I please answer that? Because, guys, listen, take it from me, all right? I lived through this. I went to the edge to toss myself into the oblivion, right? But I didn't. I went the distance to go get the fucking truth because nobody else did. And the thing about the problem with Rogan and all those guys, they're like, yeah, they think it's a natural circumstance and that this is what people do.
It's just selfish.
They still don't get control fraud. This is a thing. Yeah. They don't get Gresham's dynamic. This is a thing. They don't get perverse incentives through what we call modern executive compensation. These are the rules written by the guys that do it. And then on top of it, they pull the end around with our financial system. So, you know, for example, a lot of people can get into like fictional depictions of like, you know, theft, and we all love a, crime mystery. We all love, Game of Thrones. It's all a combination of this. The smartest people in our culture are the writers on some of these wonderful shows that exist because they know the truth. They just tell you the stuff within all these fictional depictions. And ultimately, if you combined, for example, going back to my generation, but Oceans 11, 12, and 13, when they hit the casino and they pulled off that grift, ultimately, I think they walked with $180 million, and that was a big deal. Enough of a big deal to get the biggest men in Hollywood to act like it was a big deal, right? We're talking at least $50 trillion. You can do 1,000 billion and a trillion. You can send 1 billion, I think, dollars on top of each other to the moon and back, or halfway back. The entirety of our financial system, the GDP is like, what, 25 trillion, right? And that's like everything. Probably even the hookers, right? And the drug dealers, and everybody in the dark shadows, whatever. We're talking 25, 30 trillion dollars. These guys who represent literally probably less than 1% of the population got away with everything. Why are we going to let them do that? Because they're going to blow us up again because of what Gordon said, which is the most important. Nobody's stopping them. If they don't get stopped, the carnage continues because they're incentivized. And you're right. Yeah, if you got a bunch of hookers and you got a penthouse apartment and you got your kids going to private school and you can think you're all that because you're stroking checks to your local, police department in your local school, and you're like thought of it as this kingpin while you're stealing from everybody. We need to understand as society, fuck that guy. Fuck that guy. He's a piece of shit. And by the way, I am not a communist or a Leninist or anything remotely like that. I do believe in social democracy when shit hits the fan, right? Like what happened in the Roosevelt. And I should have said this earlier because this is what you've been asking the whole time. And this is everything that I'm all about. So Roosevelt created the New Deal, right? And that's kind of, to pick up after the scourge of the Great Depression and these work projects. And then we had World War II, and that put the country back to work. I am a producer. I am an entrepreneur, which you have to deal with money, which makes you a competitor. Capitalism has got this ring nowadays that's like it's all associated with bad shit, and that's because a lot of bad shit happens. In reality, capital is just like fire. It's how you use it. You can burn down the fucking store, or you can actually grow a garden. It's how you ever want to use it. Money is just money. It's a currency of exchange.
Energy.
Or of wealth. It's energy. It's how do we do it? And so for me personally, do I want to see a society where somebody like Michael Jordan can't exist, the greatest that's ever been, that wins X amount of championships and sells, minus, his stuff being made in countries where they exploit, third world labor or whatever. Do I think he shouldn't be as successful as he is? Fuck no. I think him and Brady and all of the guys who actually are elites, that's what our society does. When you get to the top of the game because you're the best, yes, you should be rewarded. You should not be rewarded for being a fucking diabolical, a freaking denizen of fucking theft. You're just a punk ass bitch. Sorry to go back to my third grade fucking playgrounds. I just want people to understand somebody's got to step up to these guys because of what Gordon said. Everybody that's younger needs to understand. They know they're going to get away with it. You either buy in and you play that system and you fuck everybody else, or you get on to the next generation because we got to reboot the system now.
Here. www.thecon.tv, is it, or .com?
.tv. That's where you can see the con, and you can catch me all over the place, but www.thecon.tv. And for everybody who can't make it to DC, we're going to have an online rally as well. I hope we can get hundreds of thousands of people on an online rally, because I'm going to have the best of the best of the best that are going to give you the insight outside of everything that I actually just told you, but better.
Perfect. Please, everybody, go to www.thecon.tv. Watch this series. Seriously, like, give yourself the time to sit through this series. It will take you through a lot of information, but it's not hard to understand where it's going. It's not super heady. It's got good writing to it, so you'll understand the story as it goes along, but it really does lay out everything that Patrick has just been telling you. This does go very deep. And again, as I said it in the beginning, it's something that a lot of people feel comfortable saying that, you know what, this is just, well-intended people going astray. And, oops, I'm sorry. These are good people. We shouldn't have done it. No, this is a different kind of game here. This was more intentional than you would realize. And you just saw the trailer. It goes super deep in this show. And I definitely think the tagline for the con should be the show BlackRock does not want you to see. I think that perfectly well sums it up. You see all the faces. This is investigative journalism at its finest. So please go there and watch it. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the kind of content that Gordon and I bring to you as often as we can. Every single week at 5 p.m. Eastern on Thursdays, we bring people like Patrick to you to give you a story and to give you some information that you would not get elsewhere. We do this specifically because we respect you as an audience. We respect the fact that even if some of what's being said is above your pay grade, if you will, even if you don't understand all of it, you deserve to know. And you also, we are not going to pander to you wanting to get a half-assed story or to basically like make excuses for what's happening. We're also not going to pretend like we know everything on this show, but what we'll talk about is these kinds of things that you really should know. If you live anywhere in this world right now, the 2008 financial crisis is extremely important to you. It affected you in some way. And just so you know, there isn't any outrunning this. There isn't any, let's find a country that isn't doing this and run off there. This is a world issue that we're dealing with, and it's coming to a head. And I believe this decade alone will show that much. So please, every Thursday at 5 p.m., we have people with brilliant stuff to tell you, just like Patrick. Come back, support us, go to benjosephstewart.com, sign up, become a member. You get access to all my awakening protocols and deeper dives. Please, on November 1st, if you can, show up in DC, and show up in DC with a good attitude. And no, we're not going to enter any buildings. I'll be there probably interviewing Patrick and doing a little bit of filming. And if you can't attend that, please attend the online rally. With that being said, I love you all. I appreciate you all. The one thing I want to leave you with is don't just learn this stuff and let it rattle around in your head. Engage with it somehow. Do something. And if you don't know what, if you're feeling timid because a lot of this feels scary to you, accept that that's just normal, but talk to some people. See what you can do to engage, because as Patrick said, the number one thing that is allowing this to move forward as it has been is the fact that 99.9% of the population is really just sitting around with their thumbs up their asses, and they're not engaging with the proper solutions. With that being said, I love you all. I appreciate you all, and I'll catch you next time on the Ben Stewart Podcast.
Rock and roll, dude.